My name is Ramzi Nasir. I'm here on behalf of the One Democratic State Initiative, and today we are interviewing the famous Lex. Lex, did you want to introduce yourself briefly before we begin?
I'm not sure whether I'm that famous, but my name is Lex Takkenberg. Uh, I have been dealing with the question of Palestine for the last 35 years now. Yes, I'm that old. I have worked for 31 years with UNRWA in different parts of the Middle East and in different positions, and retired from them at age 60 4 years ago, and returned to Europe. But Palestine obviously did not leave me, so I continue to be engaged on the question of Palestine, through my work as a senior advisor for Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, a wonderful NGO based in Jordan that deals with a whole range of social justice issues in relation to the Arab world. And I have the privilege of leading for them a program on Palestine that looks at UNRWA and Palestinian refugees. It looks at what we call decolonizing Palestine, and through that lens, I've also been very interested in pursuing the different approaches beyond two-state, including ODSI, or the ODS movement more broadly, and the ODSI initiative in particular. And we also work on issues of justice and accountability.
Fantastic. That's actually quite a good that introduction about yourself gives us a good layout for the conversation we want to have today. The only missing piece, of course, that I think we want to add is the genocide itself that is currently underway. But I think if we break it into pieces, we'll get to all of those parts. It's a great honor to have you with us. Really appreciate you taking the time. You have become famous lately. You're making a lot of the rounds on media, speaking about what is happening. And it's good to have some time to go a little bit deeper into depth to explore context, histories, and connections between everything. So I suppose the best place to start would be to ask you when and how I mean, you're Dutch, I presume. Takkenberg, is that right? Is that a Dutch name? Yes.
Yeah, you got it right.
How and why and when did you become interested in the Palestinian cause?
Well, that's a nice question, and it prompts me to prompt you to a book that was just published by an edited volume that was just published by Rosemary Saye, entitled "Becoming Pro-Palestinian," and it collects testimonies of people like me who have been working on Palestine and justice for Palestine. And it's a fascinating sort of insight into what moves people to sort of join the quest for justice. In my case, very brief, I studied international law. During my studies, got introduced in issues of refugee law. That landed me a few years later in a job as legal officer with the Dutch Refugee Council, dealing with refugees and asylum seekers in the Netherlands. That was so fascinating that after 5 years, I thought, wow, I want to continue to work in this field. But then, the Netherlands is very small, so I want to do it in an international context. And then I applied for UNHCR, the General UN Refugee Agency, but they were in a process of sort of downsizing at a time. And then one friend told me that UNRWA, it was the time of the first Intifada, was also looking at people with a protection background. It was before the internet, there was no advertisement, but I sent an open application. And that landed me in my first job with UNRWA, just on a 5 month contract as a kind in a protection program in the West Bank starting in February 1989, and the 5 months became 31 years with a range of different roles and positions, and then having worked with refugees and refugee law in the Netherlands and in sort of a European context, I had got sort of fascinated or intrigued, I would say, by the fact that the Palestinian refugees were the only category of forced displaced for whom a special arrangement was made in the international refugee regime. UNRWA instead of UNHCR, a special provision in the UN Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention. And I didn't understand why at the time I was working with the Dutch Refugee Council. Then I joined UNRWA, was asked after 6 months to contribute an academic article to a journal on refugee law. And when researching that article, I began to sort of get an insight into that question. But more importantly, I realized that although there were whole libraries written at the time about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there was nothing specifically about the legal aspect of the refugee issue. And I thought, wow, this may be a nice subject for a PhD. And at a time I was transferred from Gaza in early 1990, from the West Bank to Gaza. There was a non-family station, so my family stayed behind in East Jerusalem. And so I thought, well, I will have time on my hand. Now it's the time to pursue this idea. And in the Netherlands, you can do a PhD as a remote student. You don't have to do coursework at the university. You just have to find one or more supervisors and have to write, sort of a full dissertation, a real book, in lieu of doing any coursework. So that's what I did, and yeah, so I had this parallel track. One leg I was sort of working with and for Palestinians as a manager, initially in this protection program. Then I was coordinating emergency relief in Gaza. And with the other leg, I was sort of in academia, reflecting on sort of the legal status of the Palestinians. And yeah, so that's how my interest was sort of garnered. And to be honest, when I first arrived with UNRWA in the West Bank, I knew very little about the Palestinian cause. It was still at the early stages of the Intifada. It sort of looked all sort of very black and white, and later I sort of began to understand sort of the different shades of gray and all the nuances and the history and the legal aspects and the political aspects. So yeah, that's how I got into the issue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I understand that trajectory. It's been the question of UNRWA and UNHCR has been something which has repeatedly come up over the years. And in general, I don't find it very well explained anywhere. I wonder if it might be worthwhile for us to take a very brief moment and try to explain to our audience. You probably know more than I. As far as I'm aware, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, was set up to be the UN agency responsible for protecting Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war. And it was created before the establishment of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which came afterward. And when UNHCR was created, a decision, arguably a political decision, was taken not to integrate UNRWA into a more broader UN refugee agency. And so we ended up with these two separate regimes. Beyond that, I don't have a great deal of understanding. Could you flesh out that story just a little bit? I think it might be worthwhile.
With pleasure. You're quite close, but there is a bit more nuance to it. Firstly, UNRWA and UNHCR were actually created at the same week of December 1949. That is, the resolution to create both bodies was passed, one on Monday and the other on Thursday, or vice versa. However, UNRWA started 6 months later in 1 May, or 5 months later, on 1 May 1950. And UNHCR, I think, started another year later. They still had to elaborate its statute, etc. Now, why two agencies? The post-Second World War sort of evolution of, an establishment of a global international human rights regime, of which sort of a regime to protect refugees was a sort of a subset. There was, on the one hand, a tendency to sort of establish universal arrangements applying to all human beings wherever they are, including sort of a universal refugee regime. But specifically with respect of refugees, before the Second World War, the modus operandi, the way of dealing with refugee crisis by the international community was on an ad hoc basis. Whenever there was a refugee problem, there was a commission created to deal with that refugee problem. And we're talking 48, 49, 48. Israel was established in May. We're dealing with the aftermath of the Second World War in Europe. So when the UN General Assembly confronted two refugee situations that both required an institutional response, it still slipped back into that ad hoc mode of creating two organizations for two distinct refugee problems. UNHCR was initially the agency to deal with the residual refugee caseload of the Second World War that had not yet been resettled or found to proper status. And only later, after 1967, when the UN protocol on the status of refugees was adopted, it became the Global Refugee Agency as we know it today. And the second refugee problem for which arrangements needed to be made was UNRWA. And so still an ad hoc response to the two different refugee situations with an arrangement elaborated, I mentioned December 49, the decision was taken to create these two agencies. A year later, or at the time, there was already a drafting process of the UN Refugee Convention, which was adopted in 51. There was also the drafting process of the statute of UNHCR, contrary to UNRWA, which only has a resolution sort of setting out its terms of reference. For UNHCR, a more detailed statute was elaborated. So in the negotiations on that statute, and then subsequently also on the Refugee Convention, the fact that already arrangements had been made specifically for Palestinian refugees, not only by means of UNRWA, but the famous resolution 194, and I'm sure we will talk about that more, created also a UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, and that body got the initial task to sort of protect the Palestinian refugees, and in particular to protect them by pursuing their right to return that the General Assembly had acknowledged as applying to them when it adopted Resolution 194 in December 48, so a year earlier. Now, this Conciliation Commission sort of did not succeed. It was headed by the US and with Turkey and France as other members. We spoke about why UNHCR and UNRWA were created as sort of, two parallel refugee agencies dealing with two specific refugee situations. But the establishment of UNRWA was preceded by the establishment of the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine. This Conciliation Commission for Palestine replaced the position of the UN mediator for Palestine, Count Bernadotte, and it was Count Bernadotte who was a very experienced humanitarian and therefore also an expert on international humanitarian law that witnessed sort of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the forced displacement of of Palestinian civilians during the 48-49 war. And he instantly recognized that war crimes were being committed. This had just been confirmed in the Nazi Germany context by the Nuremberg tribunals a few years earlier. So nobody had any doubt that war crimes were being committed. War crimes attract both individual criminal responsibility on the perpetrators. They also attract state responsibility for the state for whom the perpetrators work, to make reparations. Now, reparations, to make good, to reverse the situation. Reparations in a situation of mass forced displacement entail restitution of property, return to the original homes, and where such property is damaged or demolished, compensation, financial compensation. So he made that recommendation in his progress report in September 48. And a day later, he was assassinated by Jewish guerrillas officially outside the government, but with nevertheless with close ties to the new Israeli government. And so after the shock and sort of despair of that act, the General Assembly considered how to move forward with sort of attempting to make peace in Palestine. And so it went from an individual to a commission, to the what became the Conciliation Commission for Palestine. And in that same resolution, it also incorporated, and the General Assembly knew quite well what it did. It incorporated this right of return, also to sort of signify that that this was already part of existing international law at the time. The resolution did not create, as sometimes is incorrectly believed, did not create the Palestinian right of return. It just affirmed that the law at the time contained a right of Palestinians to return to their original homes. And so this Conciliation Commission, chaired by the US with Turkey and France as members, started sort of working to realize a return of the refugee, an implementation of the resolution. And they hit a wall, almost from the beginning, with Ben-Gurion, the first Israeli president, and Ben-Gurion sort of totally refused to take refugees back, sort of arguing that the state was still in its formative stage and had already enough of a demographic problem with those Palestinians that stayed behind on its back. And so, to make a long story short, already 6 months after the initial attempts to convince Israel to return, the Americans on the commission started to shift gear and began to look for an alternative to return. Now, in sort of the international refugee regime, there are roughly three potential solutions for refugee situations. One is voluntary return, voluntary repatriation when the situation so allows. And return is also a human right. It's also a right that flows, especially in the case of the Palestinians, from the illegality of the ethnic cleansing, as I mentioned. If return, for whatever reason, doesn't work, or if the refugees themselves don't want it, the next best solution is local integration into countries of first asylum, into sort of the host countries. And if also that does not work, then there is third country resettlement as sort of the third best solution. Now, these solutions number 2 and 3, there is no right to them. They are subject to the sovereign decisions of countries of asylum, of host countries, and third countries offering opportunities for resettlement. So the Americans started to shift from sort of the mandate given by the General Assembly to work towards sort of just to pursue local integration. And they actually thought they had a model that could be pursued for that purpose, and that was the economic recovery model that was one of the economic recovery programs of the New Deal in the US after the 1929 financial market crash, the so-called Tennessee Valley Authority. And that was a large-scale public work scheme aimed to integrate hundreds of thousands of unemployed American workers back into the economy of Tennessee. And somewhat naively, they thought, well, maybe we can apply this scheme in the Jordan Valley and in the Euphrates Basin. So they asked the president of the TVA to do a feasibility study under the auspices of the Conciliation Commission. That happened in the autumn of 49. And Gordon Clapp, as the TVA president was called, indeed sort of confirmed this optimism and said, yes, this can be done. And the Arab countries are sort of interested. We need an agency to do that. And that could not be the UNCCP because that had a completely different mandate. So that was one of the reasons to create UNRWA. The second reason was that initial relief to the refugees had, until that point, so we're talking late 49, so a year and a half into the Nakba, had until that point been provided by three humanitarian NGOs: the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee in Gaza, the League of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Syria and Lebanon, and the ICRC in Palestine and Jordan, the West Bank and Jordan. These agencies in the autumn of 49 said, you know, this crisis is, there's no rapid solution. This is beyond our capacity as NGOs. The UN has to take over as of May next year, as of the end of the winter. And so this is what the UNCCP was confronted with, and that became the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. Relief standing for what we today call the whole sort of remit of humanitarian assistance, and Works standing for public work schemes with the aim to economically integrate refugees into the economies of the host countries through labor-intensive work schemes, in the hope that after they were economically integrated, you know, they would also become socially and politically integrated and ultimately legally integrated, so that this alternative to return would be achieved. So in that context, I often say that sort of UNRWA was born in original sin. You know, within 12 months, the UN General Assembly, when it created UNRWA, sort of departed 180 degrees from the original direction of the pursuit of a solution to the refugee issue through return. And that also explained why host countries and Palestinian refugees themselves have sort of had an ambivalent relationship with UNRWA. On the one hand, they saw in UNRWA as a embodiment and confirmation that the plight of the refugees, including sort of their unfulfilled right of return, was still an international concern and an international responsibility. On the other hand, they were also not stupid, and they realized what sort of the American and Western sort of donor community had in mind in sort of trying to effectively resettle the refugees in the host country, and so that is sort of the picture that we have seen, and that in many ways continues until this day. And later on, I can also talk a little bit about, you know, Israel's relationship with UNRWA and how, you know, the current assaults by Israel and the defunding by the US sort of in essence built on this historic sort of legacy.
Yeah, I mean that is a little bit where I wanted to go next. Not so much asking you about Israel's relationship with UNRWA. I think most of us can understand why Israel would not like UNRWA to exist at all. But I think the circumstances of UNRWA's existence allow Israel to attack it as an agency that is a primary employer in the Gaza Strip, as an agency that provides food for people in the Gaza Strip. Um, and as an agency which affirms that the Palestinians are a refugee, the world's largest refugee population, as opposed to just people living
Yeah.
in the. So for me, in the context of where we are today, UNRWA's existence and uh, I don't know if it would be as easy, and I think a lot of people watching on social media have this question. Surely can't just be me alone. It surely would not be so easy for Israel to attack UNRWA if they were attacking, for example, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. So the fact that it is a separate agency somehow facilitates its defunding, its the bombing of its centers. So if after if I heard you correctly, you said that it was after 1967 when the UNHCR originally established as a body for residual refugees after the Second World War, primarily in Europe, under its remit, took on a role for all refugees globally. The question I have, and I know it's perhaps a minor detail of history, but in this context of what's happening, I'm it's been it's a question which has been nagging at me, and I can't let this opportunity to ask an expert to help resolve it for me go away. Why in 1967, when the UNHCR became a global body for all refugees, was a carve out, the pre-existing carve out for UNRWA deliberately maintained? Why was UNRWA not folded into UNHCR at that moment of consolidation?
It's a very good question. I think it has a lot of first and foremost, it had to do with this Arab suspicion and Palestinian suspicion vis-a-vis the intentions of the international community towards the Palestinian refugees. As I mentioned earlier, they saw that in a matter of 12 months, the General Assembly shifted from a solution based on return to a solution based on local integration. And they saw a potential absorption by UNHCR as a further sort of attempt to undermine the right of return, to jeopardize the right of return, and thereby to undermine the Palestinian cause. Just 2 years earlier, in 1965, the UNCCP had de facto become defunct. It stopped to operate. It was not formally abolished, but after it failed to realize the return of the refugees, and it started sort of to work on compensation, and for that purpose, it carried out a very commendable initiative, and that is to document the entire property losses that Palestinians had suffered in 48, 49. And that was a meticulous survey that took, over 12, 13 years and was eventually concluded in 64, I think. After that was sort of ended and there was no more progress towards return and compensation, the UNCCP became defunct, also against the wish of the Palestinians and the especially the sort of the Arab states who were saying this has always been an American betrayal or a Western betrayal. As I said, U.S., France, and Turkey making up the commission. So that's the time frame, and then sort of folding the Palestinian refugee caseload into UNHCR, was haram, was taboo, was something, to stay far away from it, and even Israel did not pursue it at the time. I mean, at various intervals, both sort of pro-Israeli advocates and Palestinian or pro-Palestinian advocates have both sort of argued that it would have been better had the responsibility for the Palestinian refugees been folded into UNHCR. For the pro-Israeli sort of advocates, it was the idea that UNHCR was more active on resettlement, which is really not the case. I mean, if you look at the actual numbers of resettlement, also for UNHCR, return is the number one priority. I mean, because it's the most logical, it's the most sort of intuitive. If the situation allows, refugees want to go home, full stop. So misperceptions, and for Palestinians, there was this idea that UNHCR did more on protection and particularly, also pursued durable solutions. And UNRWA, when the UNCCP ceased to operate in 1965, UNRWA did not step into the sort of the vacuum, the protection vacuum, the durable solutions vacuum that the UNCCP left behind. And so from that moment on, the Palestinian refugees became the only group of forced migrants that, without an agency sort of pursuing a solution to their plight. Now, in the absence of that situation, with that huge durable solutions protection gap, UNRWA itself became even a stronger symbol of, the unresolved refugeehood, the right of return. So don't touch UNRWA. If when UNRWA wanted to replace the tents for simple cement brick shelters in the late 50s, early 60s, refugees protested. This is Tautin, this is integration, resettlement. When UNRWA discontinued sort of the general food ration distribution and replaced it for a more selective special hardship program to free up funding to expand vocational training. Same story. There were huge protests, months and months, by refugees in all the host countries saying, UNRWA should not change its modus operandi. So this has continued over the year. When UNRWA moved from food to cash vouchers because it has more dignity and it is sort of the standard in the humanitarian discourse these days. Again, protest. The flower bag was sort of evidence of the unresolved right of return. So that's how you should see that resistance.
Yeah, that's a really interesting context, especially in light of what I'm seeing right now. The algorithms have us all in our own silos. So nowadays, you never really know what other people are seeing. There's no common sense of the news or what's happening. But from within my algorithmic silo, I'm seeing Palestinian activists, friends of mine in New York, trying to fundraise to get money for people in Gaza to pay bribes to Egyptian officials so they can escape. I see Israel dominating the agenda and its mouthpieces in Western press, pushing all manner of these solutions, blaming Egypt for not opening the border. Back in the autumn, we had this question of should the Palestinians in Gaza go to Canada, Congo, so on and so forth. I find it really offensive. I mean, I'm one of those people who would be, why are you building me a cinder block house when you should be facilitating my return? I suppose what I'm trying to ask you is, from your vantage point, where is this argument on the right of the refugee? I mean, we know 80%, 70, depending on the source, 70, 80% of the residents in Gaza are not Gazans. They're Palestinians from almost majority
48. Yeah.
What we call 1948, what is currently known as the State of Israel.
Yeah.
Tiny minority from maybe a village which is now, I don't know, near Hebron or something. But these are all from, Ashkelon,
Yeah.
Beersheba, Ramleh, these areas around Tel Aviv and so forth.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. You can see where I'm going. The question is, where is this right now on the agenda? The question of the refugee right of return. It's obviously a superior solution to further housing, temporary housing in the Egyptian desert or anywhere else. It's also a preferable option to third country resettlement, as you made clear under international humanitarian law, sense of priorities. Where is this argument right now? What needs to be done to highlight it further? And how do you view the current discourse around, or the absence of a discourse around this question?
Well, it's a very interesting one. It also takes us a little bit in sort of the way forward, and connecting what has happened since 7 October with the refugee issue, and sort of looking ahead. Well, first, the events in 7 October have brought the refugee issue and forced displacement again to the forefront. The genocide in Gaza, one important component of it is the forced internal displacement and the attempted external displacement by Israel into Egypt of again numbers much larger than during the 48-49 Nakba. So displacement is once again at the forefront. It's even argued that it's an important element of preventing progress on sort of achieving a ceasefire. That Hamas has, knowing that once again, the war crimes that were perpetrated during the genocide, including once again forced displacement, prompts sort of a duty of Israel to allow the refugees to return. So Hamas has included in its ceasefire demands the right of the internally displaced to go back to the north, to at least for those who still have remnants of a house, to go back to it, for others at least to sort of see what is left of their properties, and so forth, and just to have more space, because people are living on top of each other in a tiny space in Rafah. And once again, like in 48, the big dilemma on Israel is, do we allow these refugees to return, or do we keep them where they are? We have now got them out of the north. Part of the government wants to resettle the north, so the forced displacement issue and the right of return issue is again sort of center stage on the Israeli mind, although not everybody in sort of the amongst sort of those observing the situation realize that. Now, where is this leading to? On the one hand, I believe there are a number of different strands. First, the right of return does not depend on the continued existence of UNRWA. So the Israeli attempts to currently sort of abolish UNRWA, or at least prevent it to work in Gaza and the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem, do not, contrary to what sort of the Israeli government or the extremists in the Israeli government's belief, does not jeopardize the right of return. This right of return flows from the illegality of the ethnic cleansing, as I've indicated earlier. So the right of return is there to stay. The right of return also does not depend on whether refugees, and that's sort of a paradigm shift for which Francesca Albanese and the current special rapporteur and I, in our joint book Palestinian Refugees in International Law, are arguing. we need a paradigm shift also, the way Palestinians sort of look at solutions. The right of return does not depend on whether you live in a substandard shelter in a Gaza refugee camp or in Ain al-Hilwa, or in a $100 million villa in Beverly Hills. As I said, it does not depend on your current economic or even legal status. It flows from the fact that crimes were perpetrated. So this also means that refugees themselves should not shy away from seeking individual solutions that are good for them and their families. So those Palestinians that have found asylum in the West and have even adopted citizenship of Western countries, they still have the right of return. It gives them their passports, give them the security to advocate to become even more stronger and independent advocates for Palestinian rights, and it allows them to actually visit their villages or towns of origin. So that's one aspect that we should see. Now, in terms of sort of the legal standing and where can we go in sort of moving forward, because for 75 years nothing has moved. What we have recently seen over the last decade through the scholarship and activism of Palestinian human rights organization, and then also affirmed by Israeli human rights organization, and finally by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and most likely very soon by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion, in its second advisory opinion on sort of on the occupation, the status of the occupation, that Israel is perpetrating the crime of apartheid, as codified in the Apartheid Convention. That is a system of systematic discrimination, institutionalized discrimination in policies, practices, laws, to enshrine the Jewish supremacist and colonial privilege at the detriment of sort of the indigenous Palestinian population. And as Amnesty has very clearly articulated, the different organizations have sort of advanced the discourse, and Amnesty very correctly asserted that the denial of return is an integral component of apartheid. So the right of return and the denial of the implementation of that right of return are now an integral part of the apartheid discourse. We are currently in and that means that ending apartheid automatically entails abolishing the laws that prevent the refugees from returning, and therefore allowing their return to historic Palestine. Now, on the one hand, we can say this sounds like utopia, but I'm talking to people who sort of advocates for one democratic state. What we've learned from the situation, and there are a couple of things. We are currently faced with a one-state reality. There are 7 million Israeli Jews. There are 7 million Palestinian Christians and Arab living sort of in historic Palestine, and both peoples are
plus the refugees. If we're going to count the numbers,
outside there is another 5 million, if not more. 5.5 million registered with UNRWA, plus so many others. No, I agree with you. But even in Israel per se, there are at the moment 7 million Palestinians and roughly the same number of Israeli Jews, all governed by one government, by the Israeli government, with one national group having all the rights in the world, and the others sort of denied their rights in different gradations depending whether they live in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and you know, so that's one reality. The other thing that we have sort of learned from South Africa is that apartheid is not something you can reform. It is something that needs to be abolished. You know, you cannot settle for a little bit of discrimination. You know, let's treat them all as the 48 Palestinians as sort of second-class citizens. No, if you deal with apartheid, you have to abolish all manifestations of Israeli colonial privilege, of superiority, and of sort of detrimental treatment of Palestinians, discrimination of Palestinians, whether it is in laws, in policies, and in practices. That's where you abolish apartheid. That's what it's entailed, nothing less.
Right. So I think now with this, I think we're really getting into the heart of the matter. I am here today as an advocate for one democratic state in Palestine, the idea that from the river to the sea, there is space for the colonists to decolonize themselves and become mere immigrants, and for all the refugees to return, and for Palestinians to reclaim their country. And you're developing this argument that you know, from your history and knowledge of the law, that even under the Apartheid Convention, the international law definition of apartheid contemplates and takes consideration for the right of the refugees to return to their villages. A lot of people will say, a lot of Zionists have historically said that if the refugees return, that would be the end of the Jewish state, and therefore it's anti-Semitic, for example. In the face of what we're seeing right now in Gaza, how do you understand one democratic state and the question of, for lack of a better word, convivencia?
Very good points. As part of sort of both my work with ARDD and as sort of an intellectual and scholar who has been thinking a lot about the Palestinian refugee question, including the pursuit of solutions, I'm thinking a lot about, you know, how to move beyond 7 October. 7 October, you know, put everything upside down with respect to Israel, with respect to the Palestinians, with respect to sort of the broader Arab world. So on the one hand, that is, you know, very sort of scary for people and challenging. On the other hand, it is an opportunity to sort of go back to the drawing board as should have happened sort of long ago. Sort of the default by the sort of the Western elite that you know is still sort of trying to sort of dominate the discourse around the war in Gaza, in partly in support of Israel, partly, you know, engaging more critically with Israel, is sort of has sort of by default sort of moved back into the two-state discourse for lack of a better alternative. Now, those of us who have sort of followed the two-state discourse, have followed the Oslo process, the collapse of the Oslo process, have realized that, and I mentioned it in I remember I mentioned it in an interview, I think close to 15 years ago in a big interview in a documentary. You know, there is de facto a one-state reality. I was saying that 15 years ago. I mean, more and more people have written about it. More and more Palestinians are underscoring that. and it's sort of even penetrated Foreign Affairs and New York Times. So, nobody can deny it. Israel controls, 7 million Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel proper, and East Jerusalem, and denies them the most basic rights in different gradations, and there are an equal number of Israeli Jews. So uh, there is de facto a one-state reality. That's the starting point for looking at solutions. It's an approach to solutions. The second one is that this one-state reality is one characterized by apartheid, by constituting the crime of apartheid. So if you want to, deal with it in a very simple manner, abolish apartheid, and then you have your one democratic state. A state without apartheid is, per definition, a democratic state. The state without apartheid is a state which has the freedom to determine that the refugees, or it repels the laws that prevent refugees from returning, and the state has the freedom to make practical arrangements for the refugees who want to return to do so, and to establish relationships for or frameworks for relationships for Palestinians who want to stay in the diaspora. So in that sense, it's simple, but it's also the I would say, and that's what I take hope from. It's also sort of the discourse by default. There is a one-state reality. There is apartheid. We know from South Africa, but also from other situations like sort of the whole civil rights movement after the abolishment of slavery in the US. That institutionalized discrimination cannot last. It has not lasted in South Africa. Apartheid was not sustainable in South Africa, and it will not be in Palestine and Israel. So I believe that at the moment, in this stage of sort of the evolution, and especially in sort of mapping out a direction, also direction for Palestinian liberation post 7 October, the focus should be on abolishing apartheid, without already articulating what the end result of the decolonized historic Palestine should look like. And I believe we are in a considerable way in moving in that discourse, even though Western leaders have until now been reluctant to engage on the reports of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Why? Because they realize that engaging on apartheid, saying that apartheid needs to be abolished, will force them to look at sort of the crimes perpetrated at Israel's establishment, and thereby that Israel can no longer remain a sort of a Jewish state as we know it, and that's a bridge too far for sort of mainstream Western elites. Now, I believe the genocide in Gaza will result in a situation that they can no longer sort of deny these, can no longer continue to ignore these fundamental questions. And second, the engagement of the International Court of Justice, not only on the genocide question, as it has done with respect to the South Africa case against Israel, but again next week, Nicaragua taking on Germany for complicity, with respect to the perpetration of genocide. These are very important cases and will ultimately result in very powerful judgments. But there is also, and that will yield a decision already much quicker. There will also be the upcoming ruling of the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the occupation, and that has seen an unprecedented number of 50 states engaging on the subject, with at least 20 of them articulating that the situation in Palestine has become one of apartheid. So they have invited the International Court of Justice to pronounce on apartheid, and it's expected that this will happen. And if in the face of such a ruling, even if it's an advisory opinion, it is advisory in the sense that it advises the principal organs of the UN, in particular in this case the General Assembly, but it is declaratory of stating what the law is, and whether the law meets the criteria of whether the facts meet the criteria in this case for the crime of genocide to have been, sorry, for the crime of apartheid to have been perpetrated. So we will get, I believe we will get, and I think this is also where Palestinian solidarity, where Palestinian accountability initiatives should focus on, beyond sort of the current genocide and holding perpetrators of genocide to account discourse. You know, the longer term discourse should be centered on sort of ending apartheid, abolishing apartheid. Now, in South Africa, when the white government ultimately decided to abolish apartheid, they were first trying with Mandela to see whether they could reform apartheid. They would keep a bit of the white privilege in place, and Mandela was sort of even refusing to renounce violence until he had a commitment that apartheid would be abolished in its totality. And when that happened, there was space for a constitutional conference, a conference that would sort of, you know, a drawing board that would allow for discussing and designing a conference for the way forward in South Africa, and the current sort of Republic of South Africa was the result of that conference. That is what I envisage, you know, at the sort of, once Israel is forced, I'm convinced they will not come to the insight themselves. I think there's too much trauma. But once Israel is forced to abolish apartheid, I think we go into a similar kind of a constitutional conference, and that needs to sort of shape in what way those Jews that you know are ready to stay in historic Palestine on the basis of full equality, and the Palestinians, including those refugees that are returning, are sort of shaping the future of the country. And the most logical direction, the ones that appeals most to me, is indeed sort of the one democratic state model. I think it has the potential to most comprehensively lead to the decolonization of Palestine. You know, other alternatives like a binational state or a federal configuration, you know, run the risk of still maintaining remnants of Jewish superiority, Jewish privilege, which are very difficult to root out. So I believe sort of the one democratic state model is the most desirable, has the potential to do justice to the Palestinian people, including the refugees at large. It's also the most challenging in the sense that both Palestinians and Jews and Jews in Israel, I would say, Israeli Jews. And they will no longer be, Israeli Jews in sort of post-apartheid Palestine. They will be Jewish citizens of a new Palestinian state, the new state of Palestine. But both people still have strong attachment to national symbols, to their manifestations, more political manifestations of their respective cultures, of their patriotic songs and poets and cultures, etc., and cultural representations. And so, there is a tendency to sort of let nationalism slip into sort of the one democratic state, and this drive will be particularly strong from sort of the Jewish, but also from I believe it is similarly strong from Palestinians. So how to do away with that? I mean, take the example of the South African flag post-apartheid. That was a completely newly designed flag that had no resemblance of sort of neither the ANC flag nor the flag used by the white apartheid regime, and so it requires a sort of a sophistication of society that is a huge challenge. But I also believe that what we are witnessing, and maybe we have not even seen the worst of it, provides a unique opportunity to sort of to pursue that challenge, and to address that challenge, and to come out with a society, with a restoration of a society in which, and I've been writing that to sort of Israeli Jewish acquaintances, whom I have been in contact over the many years that I've been in the region, including academics. The resumption of a situation in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims can live in peace in one democratic state in all of historic Palestine. I think that's the direction to go for. But in terms of a strategy to get there, I believe abolishing apartheid is the sort of the anti-apartheid struggle is sort of the direction to get there. Yeah, so that gives you my sort of perspective on the way forward.
It's a very comprehensive answer. I really wish we had more time. So I would just add, if you'll permit me, one thing. I'm not quite sure there is a lot of symmetry, Lex, between Palestinian nationalism and the colonial nationalism of the Jewish Israeli state. The Palestinian flag was designed by a British colonial functionary somewhere in London. It's a variant on the flag of the Arab Revolt, which was a tool to imposed colonialism on the whole region instead. I think people are drawn to the flag and symbols and so on and so forth. There is a nationalism that is a product of a response to colonialism on the Palestinian side, and I think that the fervent nationalism that you do see among Palestinians is very much culturally constructed, smoke screen, for lack of a better word, which is really just hiding a call for and a demand for their human rights and equality and justice. And I think that the end of apartheid, should it deliver and address those concerns, would really take the helium out of the hot air balloon of Palestinian nationalism. I think that whereas an equivalent statement could not be made about Israeli colonial nationalism, which would then be threatened by its implosion. So
Exactly.
I would.
No,
I would
it's a
just.
very good, it's a very good observation. And one of the things I've also sort of raised with Alan, is that there seems to be among sort of Western audiences sort of a kind of inclination to find sort of binational approaches more tenable, more acceptable, sort of as a post-apartheid model than the one democratic state. So I believe what is very important, in parallel to the apartheid, the anti-apartheid struggle, that there is sort of a parallel discussion amongst Palestinians, but also anti-Zionist Jews, about sort of these different post-colonial and post-apartheid models, so that we use the time to demystify and also debunk the attractiveness of some of these alternative models